What happens when a laid-back Hollywood star refuses to play along with late-night host jokes? Make sure to subscribe to Fame After Hours and like and comment for more talk show coverage. Jimmy Fallon. Ladies and gentlemen, our next guest is an Academy Award-winning actor, producer, and author. Please welcome Matthew McConaughey. Audience cheers and applauds. Jimmy Fallon. Matthew, it's always great having you here. Matthew McConaughey. Good to be here, brother. Good to see you. Jimmy Fallon. You know, every time you come on the show, I feel like I should have spent the day surfing, writing poetry, and staring into the sunset. Audience laughs. Matthew McConaughey. Well, that's not a bad way to spend a day. Jimmy Fallon. See? That's exactly what I mean. You somehow make everything sound cooler than the rest of us. Audience laughs again. Matthew McConaughey. Or maybe everybody's trying too hard. The audience reacts with a mix of laughter and curious murmurs. Jimmy Fallon. Whoa, we're starting early tonight. Matthew McConaughey. I'm just saying. Jimmy Fallon. No, I get it. I get it. You're the guy who's figured life out while the rest of us are still reading self-help books. Matthew McConaughey. I don't think anybody's got life figured out. Jimmy Fallon. Really? Because social media seems convinced you do. Matthew McConaughey. Social media is convinced of a lot of things. Audience applauds lightly. Jimmy Fallon. That's true. That's fair. The conversation begins casually, and the audience settles into what appears to be a typical celebrity interview. Fallon smiles and leans forward. Jimmy Fallon. You've always had this reputation for authenticity. People feel like what they see is what they get. Matthew McConaughey. I try to be honest. Jimmy Fallon. Even when honesty gets you into trouble? Matthew McConaughey. Especially then. Audience cheers. Jimmy Fallon. Now that's a dangerous answer. Matthew McConaughey. Truth usually is. The audience responds with louder applause. Fallon laughs, but there's a slight pause before he moves on. Jimmy Fallon. Let's test that tonight. Matthew McConaughey. Depends on the test. Jimmy Fallon. Come on, don't get nervous now. Matthew McConaughey. I'm not nervous. Jimmy Fallon. You look nervous. Matthew McConaughey. No, I looked like I was listening. The audience lets out an audible, oh. Jimmy Fallon. Okay, all right. 1 point for Matthew. Audience laughs. Jimmy Fallon. You know, I heard something interesting about you recently. Someone described you as one of the few stars in Hollywood who doesn't care what people think. Matthew McConaughey. That's not true. Jimmy Fallon. No? Matthew McConaughey. Everybody cares what people think. The question is how much control you give those opinions. Audience applauds. Jimmy Fallon. See, that's why people quote you online. Matthew McConaughey. And usually get it wrong. Jimmy Fallon laughs. Jimmy Fallon. That's probably true. The interview continues, but viewers can sense a different energy developing. McConaughey is calm, but he isn't giving the usual easy, playful answers. Every question seems to turn into a deeper discussion. Jimmy Fallon. Let me ask you something. Do you ever get tired of being treated like some kind of philosopher? Matthew McConaughey. Sometimes. Jimmy Fallon. Really? Matthew McConaughey. Because people stop listening to what you're actually saying and start listening to what they want you to say. The audience becomes noticeably quieter. Jimmy Fallon. That's interesting. Matthew McConaughey. It's true. Jimmy Fallon. You think people do that? Matthew McConaughey. All the time. Jimmy Fallon. Including interviewers? The audience reacts immediately. Matthew McConaughey pauses. Matthew McConaughey. Sometimes. The crowd erupts with surprised laughter and applause. Jimmy Fallon. Are we talking about me now? Matthew McConaughey. You asked a question. Jimmy Fallon laughs loudly, but the tension is becoming noticeable. Jimmy Fallon. I feel attacked. Matthew McConaughey. You shouldn't. Jimmy Fallon. Shouldn't? Matthew McConaughey. Not unless you're guilty. The audience explodes with reactions. Jimmy Fallon covers his face dramatically. Jimmy Fallon. Ladies and gentlemen, This interview has taken a turn. Audience laughter. Matthew McConaughey. No, we're just talking. Jimmy Fallon. See, that's the thing. You say something intense, and then act like it's completely normal. Matthew McConaughey. Maybe it is normal. Jimmy Fallon. Not on television. Matthew McConaughey. Maybe that's a problem. The audience responds with a louder round of applause. Jimmy Fallon looks toward the crowd. Jimmy Fallon. Okay, now they're turning on me. Matthew McConaughey. Nobody's turning on anybody. Jimmy Fallon. Matthew, I host a talk show. My entire job is asking questions. Matthew McConaughey. And my job tonight is answering them honestly. The audience cheers. Jimmy Fallon. Fair enough. For a moment, both men smile, but the atmosphere has clearly shifted. What started as a friendly late-night conversation now feels like a debate about authenticity, media, and public perception. Jimmy Fallon. You know what? Let's go a little deeper. Matthew McConaughey. Let's do it. Jimmy Fallon. Because I have a feeling this audience wants to see where this goes. Audience cheers loudly. Matthew McConaughey. As long as we're being honest. Jimmy Fallon. That's exactly where I was headed. The audience senses that the conversation is only beginning, and the energy in the studio changes completely as Fallon prepares his next question, one that could push the discussion from playful disagreement into a genuine on-air confrontation. The audience is still buzzing from the exchange. Some are laughing. Others are leaning forward in their seats, sensing that this interview has become something different from a usual celebrity appearance. Jimmy Fallon. All right, Matthew. Since we're being honest tonight, let me ask you something that people have been talking about for years. Matthew McConaughey. Go ahead. Jimmy Fallon. Do you ever feel like Hollywood takes itself too seriously? The audience reacts immediately. Matthew McConaughey. Sometimes. Jimmy Fallon. Only sometimes? Matthew McConaughey. Well, sometimes it doesn't take itself seriously enough either. Jimmy Fallon. Now you confused everybody. Audience laughs. Matthew McConaughey. No, really. Think about it. People spend so much time creating images that they forget who they are. Jimmy Fallon. You're talking about celebrities? Matthew McConaughey. I'm talking about everybody. Jimmy Fallon nods. Jimmy Fallon. But celebrities are part of that conversation. Matthew McConaughey. Sure. Jimmy Fallon. Including actors? Matthew McConaughey. Including actors. Jimmy Fallon. Including talk show hosts? The audience lets out another collective. Oh. Matthew smiles slightly. Matthew McConaughey. If the shoe fits. The crowd erupts. Jimmy Fallon laughs, but visibly shifts in his chair. Jimmy Fallon. You really came ready tonight. Matthew McConaughey. I came ready to have a conversation. Jimmy Fallon. Some people might call this a debate. Matthew McConaughey. Only if somebody's trying to win. The audience applauds. Jimmy Fallon. Okay, let me push back a little. Matthew McConaughey. Please do. Jimmy Fallon. You talk a lot about authenticity. That's one of the reasons people respect you. But isn't there always some level of performance involved when you're famous? Matthew McConaughey. Of course. Jimmy Fallon. Then how can anyone be completely authentic? Matthew pauses. Matthew McConaughey. You can't. The audience quiets. Jimmy Fallon. Interesting. Matthew McConaughey. But you can be honest about the fact that you're performing. Jimmy Fallon. Explain that. Matthew McConaughey. Look around. We're sitting under studio lights. There are cameras everywhere. Millions of people are watching. Nobody here is acting exactly like they were sitting in their living room. Jimmy Fallon. Fair point. Matthew McConaughey. The problem starts when people forget the difference between the performance and the person. Several audience members applaud. Jimmy Fallon. You think that happens often? Matthew McConaughey. Every day. Jimmy Fallon leans back. Jimmy Fallon. That's a pretty strong statement. Matthew McConaughey. Look at social media. The audience cheers. Matthew McConaughey. Everybody's competing to look happier, smarter, richer, more successful than they really are. Jimmy Fallon, not everybody. Matthew McConaughey, a lot of people. Jimmy Fallon, you sound frustrated. Matthew McConaughey, I'm concerned. Jimmy Fallon, concerned about what? Matthew McConaughey, that people spend more time building a brand than building a life. The audience breaks into applause. Jimmy Fallon notices a reaction. Jimmy Fallon, you know they're loving this, right? Matthew McConaughey, maybe they're tired pretending too. The crowd becomes even louder. Jimmy Fallon smiles but quickly follows up. Jimmy Fallon, see, this is where I disagree. The audience reacts instantly. Matthew McConaughey, okay. Jimmy Fallon, I think entertainment has value. I think people need escape. Matthew McConaughey, I agree. Jimmy Fallon, then why criticize it? Matthew McConaughey, I'm not criticizing entertainment. Jimmy Fallon, what are you criticizing? Matthew McConaughey, the idea that entertainment should replace reality. The audience goes silent for a moment. Jimmy Fallon, that's a pretty heavy statement for a Tuesday night. Audience laughs. Matthew McConaughey, truth doesn't check the calendar. The audience erupts again. Jimmy Fallon shakes his head. Jimmy Fallon, see? That's exactly what I'm talking about. Every answer sounds like it belongs in a quote book. Matthew McConaughey laughs. Matthew McConaughey, maybe because we're asking big questions. Jimmy Fallon, or maybe because you're avoiding simple answers. The audience immediately reacts. Matthew's smile fades slightly. Matthew McConaughey, you think so? Jimmy Fallon, sometimes. Matthew McConaughey, give me an example. Jimmy Fallon, you answer questions with ideas instead of answers. Matthew McConaughey, ideas are answers. Jimmy Fallon, not always. The tension rises noticeably. Audience members begin murmuring. Matthew McConaughey, what answer are you looking for? Jimmy Fallon, a direct one. Matthew McConaughey, ask a direct question. The audience explodes. Jimmy Fallon laughs nervously. Jimmy Fallon, okay? He pauses. Jimmy Fallon, do celebrities have a responsibility to be role models? Matthew McConaughey, no. The audience reacts immediately. Jimmy Fallon, that was direct. Matthew McConaughey, you asked. Jimmy Fallon, no responsibility at all? Matthew McConaughey, people should try to be decent human beings. That's different from being role models. Jimmy Fallon, some parents would disagree. Matthew McConaughey, parents should be role models. The audience applauds loudly. Jimmy Fallon, fair enough. Matthew McConaughey, actors are storytellers. Jimmy Fallon, and storytellers influence people. Matthew McConaughey, so do teachers. So do parents. So do friends. Jimmy Fallon, you're spreading the responsibility around. Matthew McConaughey, because it belongs to everybody. The crowd cheers. Jimmy Fallon glances toward the audience and then back to Matthew. Jimmy Fallon, you've got them on your side tonight. Matthew McConaughey, it's not about sides. Jimmy Fallon, everything becomes sides these days. Matthew McConaughey, that's exactly the problem. The audience grows louder. Jimmy Fallon smiles but looks increasingly determined to challenge him. Jimmy Fallon, you know what I think? Matthew McConaughey, tell me. Jimmy Fallon, I think people love hearing these ideas because they sound good. The audience suddenly becomes very quiet. Matthew McConaughey and Jimmy Fallon, I think the harder question is whether people actually live by them. A few audience members clap. Matthew nods slowly. Matthew McConaughey, that's a fair question. Jimmy Fallon, including you. The crowd reacts immediately. Matthew McConaughey, absolutely. Jimmy Fallon, so you failed your own standards? Matthew McConaughey, many times. Jimmy Fallon, you admit that? Matthew McConaughey, why wouldn't I? The audience applauds loudly. Jimmy Fallon seems surprised by the answer. Matthew McConaughey. Anybody who tells you they got life figured out is selling something. The crowd erupts again. Jimmy Fallon looks toward the audience and then back at Matthew. Jimmy Fallon. All right, now we're getting somewhere. Matthew McConaughey. Maybe we are. Jimmy Fallon. Because I have another question. Matthew McConaughey. Let's hear it. Jimmy Fallon takes a breath, glances at his cards, and looks directly at Matthew. Jimmy Fallon. This next one might be uncomfortable. The audience immediately reacts. Matthew McConaughey. Those are usually the interesting ones. The crowd cheers loudly as Fallon prepares a question that could push their disagreement to an entirely new level. The audience settles down, but the energy in the studio is completely different now. What started as a light late-night interview has become a serious discussion, and everyone can feel it. Jimmy Fallon. All right, Matthew, let's keep going. Matthew McConaughey. I'm here. Jimmy Fallon. You talk a lot about authenticity. People love that about you. Matthew McConaughey. I appreciate that. Jimmy Fallon. But I've always wondered something. Matthew McConaughey. What's that? Jimmy Fallon. Do you think authenticity has become part of your public image? The audience reacts immediately. Matthew pauses for a moment. Matthew McConaughey. That's a fair question. Jimmy Fallon. So? Matthew McConaughey. I think every public figure has an image, whether they want one or not. Jimmy Fallon. Including you. Matthew McConaughey. Including me. Jimmy Fallon. Then how do people know what's real? Matthew McConaughey. They don't always. The audience becomes quiet. Jimmy Fallon. That's honest. Matthew McConaughey. It's the truth. Jimmy Fallon. So when people say you're different from other celebrities, what do you think? Matthew McConaughey. I think we're all more alike than people realize. Audience applause follows. Jimmy Fallon. That's interesting because fans often put celebrities on a pedestal. Matthew McConaughey. That's dangerous. Jimmy Fallon. Why? Matthew McConaughey. Because eventually people stop seeing human beings and start seeing symbols. Several audience members clap. Jimmy Fallon. You think fame creates that? Matthew McConaughey. Sometimes fame does. Sometimes audiences do. Jimmy Fallon. And sometimes celebrities do? Matthew McConaughey. Absolutely. The audience reacts with approval. Jimmy Fallon. So who's responsible? Matthew McConaughey. Everybody shares responsibility. Jimmy Fallon laughs. Jimmy Fallon. That's a very diplomatic answer. Matthew McConaughey. It's an honest answer. Jimmy Fallon. Or a safe one. The audience lets out an audible, oh. Matthew smiles slightly. Matthew McConaughey. You think it's safe? Jimmy Fallon. A little. Matthew McConaughey. I disagree. Jimmy Fallon. Why? Matthew McConaughey. Because people want simple answers to complicated questions. Audience applause grows louder. Jimmy Fallon. But viewers also want clarity. Matthew McConaughey. Clarity and simplicity aren't always the same thing. The crowd cheers. Jimmy Fallon shakes his head and laughs. Jimmy Fallon. See? That's exactly what you do. Matthew McConaughey. What do I do? Jimmy Fallon. You answer every question like it's a life lesson. Audience laughter breaks out. Matthew McConaughey. Maybe we're talking about life. Jimmy Fallon. Maybe we're talking about television. Matthew McConaughey. Those aren't completely separate. The audience applauds again. Jimmy Fallon leans forward. Jimmy Fallon. Let me challenge you. Matthew McConaughey. Go ahead. Jimmy Fallon. Do you think Hollywood is disconnected from regular people? The audience immediately reacts. Matthew thinks for a second. Matthew McConaughey. Parts of it are. Jimmy Fallon. Only parts? Matthew McConaughey. Parts of every industry are. Jimmy Fallon. That's not really a direct answer. Matthew McConaughey. It's the answer I believe. The crowd applauds. Jimmy Fallon. So you don't think entertainment has a problem? Matthew McConaughey. I think every industry has problems. Jimmy Fallon. That's broad. Matthew McConaughey. Reality is broad. The audience laughs and claps. Jimmy Fallon looks toward the crowd. Jimmy Fallon. You see what I'm dealing with? Audience laughter fills the studio. Matthew McConaughey. You asked the question. Jimmy Fallon. And you're making me work for the answer. Matthew McConaughey. Good conversations require work. The audience cheers loudly. Jimmy Fallon pauses before asking another question. Jimmy Fallon. Can I be honest? Matthew McConaughey. Please. Jimmy Fallon. I think a lot of people are tired of celebrities telling them how to live. The audience reacts immediately. Matthew nods slowly. Matthew McConaughey. Some people probably are. Jimmy Fallon. Do you understand that frustration? Matthew McConaughey. Of course. Jimmy Fallon. Then why do so many public figures keep doing it? Matthew McConaughey. Maybe because they think they're helping. Jimmy Fallon. And are they? Matthew pauses. Matthew McConaughey. Sometimes yes. Sometimes no. The audience applauds. Jimmy Fallon. That's probably the most direct answer you've given all night. Audience laughter erupts. Matthew McConaughey. Then maybe we're making progress. Jimmy Fallon laughs. Jimmy Fallon. Maybe we are. For the first time in several minutes, the tension seems to ease. Both men smile, and the audience responds positively. But Jimmy isn't finished. Jimmy Fallon. One last thing before we move on. Matthew McConaughey. All right. Jimmy Fallon. Do you think people in this business spend too much time protecting their image? The audience quiets again. Matthew McConaughey. Yes. Jimmy Fallon. No hesitation. Matthew McConaughey. None. Jimmy Fallon. Including actors? Matthew McConaughey. Yes. Jimmy Fallon. Including television hosts? The crowd erupts with loud reactions. Matthew smiles but doesn't answer immediately. Jimmy Fallon points to himself. Jimmy Fallon. Are we talking about me? The audience laughs. Matthew McConaughey. If you're asking the question, maybe you should answer it. The crowd explodes with cheers and applause. Jimmy Fallon sits back, surprised by the response. Jimmy Fallon. Wow. Matthew McConaughey. You wanted honesty. Jimmy Fallon looks toward the audience and shakes his head. Jimmy Fallon. And I think we're just getting started. The audience roars as the conversation heads toward an even more uncomfortable and unpredictable direction. The audience is still applauding after Matthew's response. Jimmy Fallon smiles, but it's clear that the conversation has become much more intense than a typical late-night interview. Jimmy Fallon. All right, Matthew, I have to admit, you've made this one of the most interesting conversations we've had in a long time. Matthew McConaughey. That's because we're having a real conversation. Audience applause follows. Jimmy Fallon. Some people watching might say we're arguing. Matthew McConaughey. I don't see it that way. Jimmy Fallon. You don't? Matthew McConaughey. No. Disagreement doesn't have to be an argument. Several audience members clap. Jimmy Fallon. That's a good point. Matthew McConaughey. People disagree too little these days. Jimmy Fallon laughs. Jimmy Fallon. I think social media would disagree with that. Audience laughter erupts. Matthew McConaughey. No. Social media proves my point. Jimmy Fallon. How so? Matthew McConaughey. People don't disagree anymore. They attack. The audience reacts loudly. Jimmy Fallon nods. Jimmy Fallon. That's fair. Matthew McConaughey. A disagreement is when two people exchange ideas. An attack is when they stop listening. Audience applause fills the studio. Jimmy Fallon. You know what's funny? Matthew McConaughey. What's that? Jimmy Fallon. I started this interview thinking I'd be asking the questions. Audience laughter. Matthew McConaughey. You still are. Jimmy Fallon. Barely. The crowd laughs again. Jimmy Fallon glances toward the audience. Jimmy Fallon. Can we agree on one thing before we wrap up? Matthew McConaughey. Depends what it is. Audience laughter follows. Jimmy Fallon. There he is. Matthew smiles. Jimmy Fallon. Can we agree that public conversations matter? Matthew McConaughey. Absolutely. Jimmy Fallon. Even uncomfortable ones? Matthew McConaughey, especially uncomfortable ones. The audience cheers loudly. Jimmy Fallon, I think that's where people get nervous. Matthew McConaughey, growth usually starts with discomfort. Several audience members stand and applaud. Jimmy Fallon, you know, there are probably people watching right now picking sides. Matthew McConaughey, that's their choice. Jimmy Fallon, and there are probably people wondering who won. Matthew shakes his head. Matthew McConaughey, nobody. Jimmy Fallon, nobody? Matthew McConaughey, good conversations aren't about winning. The audience applauds again. Jimmy Fallon pauses for a moment. Jimmy Fallon, I respect that. Matthew McConaughey, thank you. Jimmy Fallon, even if you made my job difficult tonight. Audience laughter fills the studio. Matthew McConaughey, I think you handled yourself pretty well. Jimmy Fallon, that's the nicest thing you've said to me all evening. The audience laughs and cheers. Jimmy Fallon stands from his chair. Jimmy Fallon, ladies and gentlemen, Matthew McConaughey. The crowd immediately rises to its feet with a loud standing ovation. Matthew stands and waves to the audience. Some audience members are cheering. Others are still discussing moments from the interview with the people sitting beside them. Jimmy Fallon shakes Matthew's hand. Jimmy Fallon, thanks for coming. Matthew McConaughey, thanks for having me. The applause continues as the segment comes to an end. But the conversation doesn't stop when the cameras do. Within minutes, clips from the interview begin spreading across social media platforms. One viral post reads, "That was the most intense Fallon interview I've seen in years." Another user writes, "Matthew stayed calm the entire time." A different viewer posts, "Nobody got destroyed. Two people simply disagreed and actually listened to each other." The debate quickly spreads online. Some viewers believe Matthew made the stronger points. Others argue that Jimmy asked important questions and pushed the conversation forward. Many people praise both men for keeping the discussion respectful despite the tension. Entertainment commentators begin discussing specific moments from the interview. The exchange about public image becomes one of the most shared clips. The discussion about celebrity culture sparks thousands of comments. By the next morning, reaction videos, podcasts, and news articles are all talking about the interview. Meanwhile, sources close to the show report that there was no hostility backstage after the cameras stopped rolling. In fact, both men were seen continuing their conversation after the segment ended. Several audience members later share online that the atmosphere in the studio felt intense but respectful. One audience member posts, "It felt like watching two people challenge each other without turning it into a fight." Another writes, "We need more conversations like that." As the days pass, the interview continues generating discussion. Some people focus on the disagreement. Others focus on the fact that neither guest nor host tried to walk away from the conversation. And that may be the biggest reason viewers continue talking about it. Not because someone won, not because someone lost, but because two public figures were willing to disagree in front of millions of people and keep talking. That's becoming increasingly rare. And maybe that's why the interview resonated with so many viewers. What do you think? Did Matthew make the stronger arguments? Did Jimmy ask the tougher questions? Or do you think both of them brought valuable perspectives to the discussion? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Fame After Hours for more real talk show stories.